My paper today has, as you can see, 5 parts. The practice turn, as outlined by Theodor Shatsky and others, presents one of the most significant reorientations of the social sciences in the last decade. The concept of practice has also been used to focus theoretical developments in language philosophy, in interpretive sociology, in symbolic anthropology and cultural studies, and it has helped us to understand these developments as a new paradigm. In a wealth of research fields, such as in the sociology of technology, in studies of science, or in gender studies, allowing social practices to act as a guide can reveal possible new and fruitful perspectives in order to be able to research the structured texture of social processes. Culture is not reduced to structures, to values, to structures of meanings, to value structures or texts. Rather, it is a question of understanding doing culture. How culture is produced and practiced interactively. Practice theories are interested in regular interaction, in routines and habits. In particular, their aim is to understand the order of social events which is produced and maintained by practices. Practice theory, according to my thesis, is implicitly a theory of social order and is therefore trapped in the thinking of social theory in the 19th and 20th century. It is primarily interested in reproducing the existing order. In 2011, however, across the world, there were uprisings, rebellions and protests which rejected the existing order. The Arab Spring, the Indignados movement in Spain, or Occupy Wall Street are excellent examples of resistance by individuals and groups demanding democracy, equality and social justice. These movements not only protested on the streets, but they also made use of the internet, social networks and wireless communication. In various ways, their digital practices voice their protests, calling for joint action and leading to the formation of autonomous communication networks, which seek to bring about a new world. In my lecture, I would like to analyze whether practice theory needs to be rethought or perhaps reconceived in the face of digital media practices. It seems to be guided too much by the questions and classical approaches of the 19th and 20th century. Therefore, for example, it is determined by the central question of sociology, how social order is possible. Our life in the 21st century is, however, not only shaped socially, it is primarily a media life. For us, there is no longer a life outside the media. Above all, digitalization has led to a state where everything we do is linked to the use and appropriation of media. The world, as we perceive it and experience it, is made real by the media. In some ways, the scenarios of science fiction films like Existence or The Matrix are already a reality. We no longer live with the media, but rather we are already living in the media. Therefore, a social network like Facebook creates a giant archive where nothing is forgotten and whose social consequences we cannot foresee. It grows incessantly because of our activities. Becoming media seems to be the inevitable reality of the 21st century. Against this background, I would like to begin by examining what challenge digital practices present to practice theory. I will ask how sensible it still is to be guided by the concept of social order and its reproduction in a world which is defined by digital networks. How is culture changed under digital conditions? How does power arise in these contexts? How can it be challenged and called into question? Based on a digital culture of participation, creativity and connectivity, I will then discuss the conditions of media practice in the 21st century. The example of internet-based new social movements shows that new forms of subjectivization are arising as well. In this, the demand for equality is dominant. I will go into this question in more depth by discussing the pedagogical approach of the French philosopher Jacques Rancière. Next, I will discuss the consequences for media literacy in the digital age. How can we educate for future practices in the digital age? What are good pedagogical practices and initiatives in a making and doing? Initiatives in a making and doing culture. In conclusion, I will summarize the most important outcomes of my talk. Second part, digital practices as a challenge for practice theory. In his book, The Side of the Social, Shetsky stresses that practices are organized activities and produce social order. Over and over, they recreate social reality. In different places and times, activities that are anchored in the physical world are produced in the same way. The requirement for this is that practices are based on a shared, implicit knowledge. This accounts for their social character. Practices are characterized by practical ability. Their steady, everyday repetition links space and time. Practices are bound in a quotation, routinized nexus of doing and saying. End of quotation. They represent routinized movements and bodily activities. Practices deal with things and artifacts, however, at the same time they comply with their own know-how. This does not mean, however, that artifacts can be used and understood arbitrarily. Instead, at the heart of Shetsky's practice theory, which is heavily influenced by the philosophy of language of the late Wittgenstein, is how human subjects use artifacts. He shows how complexes evolve from practices and orders and how these can be changed. For Shetsky, orders are based locally. They arise from contexts which are created by practices. The British professor of communication, Nick Coultree, concludes in his new book, Media, Society, World, Social Theory and Digital Media Practice, that he understands media as practices, as forms of acting or doing that are socially based and produce regularity of action. Our media practices are linked with other practices and convey to us ontological security. They are part of the context constituting hanging together of lives. Shetsky. Therefore, reading the daily newspaper or the use of newspaper apps in the morning prepares us for the day. Practice theory allows these entanglements of practices and their regularity to be examined. Coultree concludes, quotation, media are best understood as a vast domain of practices that, like all practices, in Shetsky's view, are social at a basic level through the very acts that stabilize them as practices and distinguish specific practices from each other. However intriguing the perspectives of Shetsky and Coultree are, and however much exploration they may suggest, it also becomes very clear that they are still focusing on the person acting. Coultree even goes so far as sometimes equating practices with action. He considers it important to ask, quotation, what types of things do people do in relation to media? And what types of things do people say, think, believe in relation to media? Even Shetsky is of the opinion that humans use artifacts like computers, but not the reverse, that computers or their software use people. The digital transformations in the 21st century, however, demand that we view the world not only from the perspective of those acting, but also that we analyze the significance of autonomous information and communication structures for everyday practices. New perspectives then arise in relation to the social order and its possible transformation. The idea of social order was always linked to the concept of states, of national states. Global information and communication structures, networked flows stand increasingly in place of social structures linked to national states. In my view, we only form an adequate understanding of digital practices and of culture in the digital age by examining this development. Shatsky and Coulter think, like most social theorists or sociologists, about the social order. How can the social order be produced, reproduced, or maintained? I, however, would like to examine the possibility of other perspectives. Do digitally supported social movements which use digital media intensively, from the Zapatistas to Occupy Wall Street, not express a desire for equality and for a different social order? Manuel Castells is one of the few sociologists who placed at the heart of his work the changes in society caused by new information and communication structures. Societies and their orders can, in my opinion, only be analyzed adequately when we examine and understand the media technologies which are available to them. Therefore, digital technologies have led to a change of social structures and a change in how information is organized. We live today in a networked society in which the power of the national state is challenged by globalization and deregulation. Quotation Castells: a network society is a society whose social structure is made around networks, activated by microelectronics-based, digitally processed information and communication technologies. End of quotation. Following Marshall McLuhan, Castells defines culture in the context of technology and technology in the context of culture. Because culture is increasingly mediatized and digitalized, the established cultures where systems of meaning and values are increasingly transformed. For Castells, in the 21st century, culture does not only consist of interpretive patterns of values and norms, it is also based on information technologies. Digital media help us to create and manage our own subjectivity in the context of our networks. Above all, Web 2.0 applications produce a culture of sharing, of communication, and of mutual appreciation. We can write a blog, create our own homepage, or place a video on YouTube. Different forms of cultural production and creativity are possible, which can then be circulated on our own networks. A making and doing culture arises. In his book, What's the Point of School?, Guy Claxton demonstrates that more and more teachers reject the sit-back-and-be-told concept of school teaching, and that they are making their pupils ask their own questions. They develop different strategies and solutions together. Learning is seen as an interactive, collaborative, and ongoing process in which both teacher and pupils are engaged. The basis for this change in the approach to culture is found in the forms of interactivity and participation which are made possible by Web 2.0. They change how we organize our practices and how we spend time with others. For example, enthusiastic viewers of TV series write critiques and make amateur films, and so become co-producers. In addition, the Internet provides a massive archive of series which can be consumed. Digital media allow us to pursue our specialist interests, to work creatively with others, and to become a community of choice. We can creatively foster and expand our cultural preferences and identities. Castells also introduced the idea of a space of laws, which has become even more important with contemporary digital possibilities. in particular in the field of mobile communication. A space of laws refers to a social simultaneousness which is formed in the technical infrastructure without territorial proximity. The space of laws creates new connections which will be a key part of future educational practices. It is an important precondition if you are going to organize shared projects with others, sharing ideas and practices, and networking creatively. Furthermore, we can engage with other stories, experiences, and cultures, overcome our own prejudices, and becoming more cosmopolitan. In summary, we can state that the present public sphere is networked, digital, and mobile. Above all, the new social movements seek a renewal and the revitalization of democracy. In the interaction between real places and digital networks, a space arises for autonomy. Here a battle for equality takes place, but equality is already in use. Digital practices are used to make equality real. Quotation Castells. The legacy of networked social movements will have been to raise the possibility of relearning how to live together in real democracy. End of quotation. Improvements in broadband technology and the development of social software in the first decade of the 21st century have enabled the creation of autonomous networks which are controlled by the users themselves. Social networking sites have produced a culture of sharing. Content is produced and linked to other content, transcending space and time. People present themselves on the internet because they want to engage with others, to share resources, and to be recognized socially. Therefore, they produce networks and stay connected. It has become clear that we can only have an adequate understanding of the relevance of digital practices in the 21st century when we consider their role in the constitution of networks and in the transformation of society. They radically change cultural and social structures. For Shatsky and Coltree, digital practices merely present additional opportunities which are linked to other practices. We must, however, challenge with this focus on social order, which is so important for the self-understanding of social theory. Instead, we must ask what new cultural and social formations are made by digital practices. Even here, there are orders, but these are challenged and transformed over and over again. Third part, Jacques Rancière's contribution to education. We can deepen our understanding of these new social movements and of the possibilities of digital practices if we turn to the political thinking of Jacques Rancière. This has become increasingly important in recent years in debates on education. It is based on democratic politics' need for equality. In his study, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, 5 Lessons in Intellectual Emancipation, Rancière shows that education should be based on the equality of intelligence. Only in this way, he states, can intellectual emancipation be achieved. His thinking allows us to view the problem of order from a new perspective. For him, it is closely linked to the power of the state. He considers this based on Foucault as a police order which seeks to design and control human life. The police embrace practices which control the population's behavior, so the power of the state is increased and can grow and prosper. The new social movements which use digital media are fundamentally. They assume their members are equal. Because of this, they express their dissensus towards the social order which denies them this equality. For Rancière, dissensus is a key characteristic of democratic politics. It challenges the police order which assigns defined spaces to people, practices, and things, and which regulates these. Forms of marginalization and exclusion, as well as a distribution of the sensible, are part of this. Dissensus, on the other hand, requires a distance of the sensible from itself. It leads to processes of political subjectivization. People who were previously excluded or were invisible in the context of the police order raise their hands and take part in public debates and political discussions. They call for their equality, they strike, demonstrate, and create autonomous networks. People become subjects by rejecting the classifications of the police order and by demanding their equality in language and action. Subjects arise in debates, in processes of disagreement in which we seek to use their equality and to validate it. But Rancière points out that democratic politics are rather improbable. In the digital age, however, there is growing hope that this is no longer exceptional, but rather that it will happen more and more often. Demands for radical democracy create forms of subjectivization which were not foreseen by the state and society. In this way, the police order is challenged. Equality is tested and verified in concrete situations. For Rancière, therefore, emancipation can only be realized by the subjects themselves, if they accept their equality and act accordingly. Against this background, Rancière analyzes the history of the pedagogue Joseph Jacotot in The Ignorant Schoolmaster. In this, he establishes that, as a rule, the process of education is based on a fundamental inequality between the educator and those who experience the education. Jacotot, a French teacher, while in exile in Leuven, Flanders, in the first decade of the 19th century, developed a doctrine of universal teaching. This is based on the equality of the intelligence of all human life. He spoke no Flemish. Because of this, he could not use explanation to excite and encourage the learning process in his students. Therefore, he gave students a bilingual version of Fenelon's Télémaque to read. Once they had read half of the first book, he asked them to read it again, several times before reading the rest. To his great surprise, after this intensive reading task, students could write in French, some better than native speakers. Because Jacotot had not explained the grammar of the language to his students, this caused him to become skeptical of explanation, which is usually at the heart of educational activity. He came to the conclusion that explanation is one of the foundational myths of pedagogy, a myth which creates a world consisting of the knowing and the not knowing, of the intelligent and the less intelligent. Explanation makes the learner immature, dulls his mind, and robs him of the power to learn independently. On the other hand, his students learned without explanation. He had not taught them any knowledge, but rather had taught them a subject which he himself did not know by asking them to use their own intelligence. Jacotot accepted that students and their teachers are intellectual equals. Rancière draws on this and establishes that equality of intelligence is a prerequisite for emancipation. People must use their intelligence in order to show that they are equal to all speaking beings. Rancière is interested in what happens when we accept this assumption. He shows we cannot be emancipated by learning in the traditional education system. No institution can emancipate a single person because they are always founded on inequality. Rancière concludes, quotation, "One only needs to learn how to be an equal man in an unequal society, as this is what being emancipated means." End of quotation. The new social movements demonstrates in urban streets and in digital networks the equality of all human beings and try to make this assumption real in concrete situations. In Rancière's theory, their actions are political because they reveal the incompatibility of the logic of police order with the logic of equality. Other fields of the making and doing culture, as well as web 2.0 are based on the equality of the users. More and more people communicate, producing and sharing creative content. They reject traditional learning methods and the passivity of traditional entertainment. Instead, they organize and form their own processes of learning and entertainment. Against the background of these developments and positions, I would now like to discuss how educational practices should appear in the 21st century. What can we learn from the new social movements and the digital practices in Web 2.0? Can Shakoto also be our ignorant schoolmaster? How might good pedagogical practices and initiatives appear? Education in the digital age. In the framework of critical pedagogy, there's a demand for a broader concept of education and a call to acquire the most comprehensive knowledge possible in the field of digital knowledge. In this approach, critical pedagogy seeks to promote both individual educational processes as well as social change to produce a society which is characterized by social justice and the creative development of individuals and groups. One of their aims is to explicitly support and initiate agency and social movements. Alongside the Frankfurt School, Paulo Freire was the primary exponent of this approach. Freire also believes in the equality of humanity. People are conscious beings located in history who together produce and creatively shape culture and reality. At the heart of their development is dialogue, in which the world is recognized, labeled, and by association renegotiated. In human practice, the world can be reformed and changed. The precise aim of an emancipatory education is to promote and maintain practice as a never-ending process. Teachers and pupils should work together and should see themselves as co-subjects. Dialogical and reflexive practices should be encouraged in pupils. Freire also takes the view that educational practices which aim to transmit knowledge cannot be emancipatory. As with Rancière, for critical pedagogy, education is a form of cultural politics. So education is primarily about the development of alternative democratic public spheres, as for example in the works of Henry Giroux or Douglas Kellner. In this, the competent and creative use of digital technologies plays an important role. Therefore, Douglas Kellner claimed that the internet is not only used to provide information, but is also seen as a cultural and political space in which we can educate ourselves, communicate with others, developing common projects, and also finding common ground. He cites an abundance of media literacies which we must acquire and refine in order to handle digital technologies competently. Making your own homepage, creatively participating on YouTube or on blogs, or creating and maintaining networks are examples of complex digital practices which can be appropriated. Therefore, doing becomes sharing and networking together. The fact that these practices are not usually imparted by teachers, but rather that they are best learned with practice by exchanging with others and by engaging with them is an essential mark of a digital culture. It is mainly teamwork which lends itself to the production of Wikipedia articles, the creation of spoof sites, the criticism of institutional policies, or to other cyber actions. Be or become the media is the motto of media education and digital activism. It reveals the contemporary and future practice in the digital age. These very group activities are often based on equality and cooperation. In dialogical communication, we can reflect on the use of new media, but our own lives can also be the focus. Therefore, in the use of YouTube, learning can become a communicative process. This can lead us to reflect on the context of our own life. It can lead to self-expressions, which in turn can again lead to reactions in our own social environment. Furthermore, YouTube can be used in the framework of social movements. This example makes clear that processes of media education can result in processes of participating in the public sphere. Digital practices can encourage educational processes, and at the same time they can provide spaces for alternative and counter-hegemonical projects which challenge the police order in the sense of Foucault and Rancière. They can contribute to the reconstruction of democratic public life. An excellent example of this is the field of alternative and active new media. Culture jamming, participatory and independent journalism, or common knowledge projects illustrate how people aspire to be visible, to promote alternative views, to create their own networks. Because of an active and competent use of digital technology, individuals and groups can realize their own performative and critical media pedagogy, which can contribute to self-empowerment and social transformation. The field of professional and practice-based education must also react to this. Socialization in careers and in professional work must remember that people in the digital age want to express themselves, produce things, and try to develop themselves creatively. They must be encouraged by the learning processes to inquire, to critically ask their own questions, and to find creative solutions along with others. Students learn together and are encouraged by their teachers to develop their own views. Like Jacques Cousteau, teachers in the digital age do not have an explicative knowledge. They are themselves actively engaged in the ongoing learning process. Students explore, reflect, try things out, and find solutions. Then they share their experiences with others by organizing exhibitions, putting on performances, expressing themselves online, and by networking. In the future, pedagogical practices and initiatives must remember that learners in the digital age are increasingly curious about the world and that they want to investigate and experiment. For them, learning is a social process, making use of digital opportunities mutually and productively. This also means that in the future, employers and managers will have less control, but instead will have to develop more trust. In this way, a work situation can be created in which work is based on personal responsibility and initiative. Digital practices and networks in the 21st century show that increasingly people are imposing on themselves a need to produce good work and the personal performance they can be proud of. Therefore, increasingly, hierarchies are being rejected, equality is enforced, and responsibilities are shared. This does not mean we reject leaders and teachers, but that these, like Jacques Cousteau, should be prepared to admit ignorance and to work cooperatively. Last point, conclusion. Starting from the theme of our conference, practice, culture, and identity, I ask myself how digitalization challenges us to reconsider these phenomena. Therefore, I began by showing that practice theory is guided largely by the phenomenon of social order of the state. There is no doubt that these orders are decisive for our lives. They are good and bad ones. A key question is, however, how orders can be dissolved or recreated. The digital media revolutionize our world. Therefore, social theory and media theory must be linked. Digital practices are more than in supplementation to existing practices. Digital networks develop which define our lives, even if we sometimes refuse to believe this. In social networks, the self of the individual is enhanced, and this creates self-selected networks of relationships and creatively communicates with others. Digital practices have also renewed democratic life, as the most recent examples have demonstrated most clearly. Based on the principle of equality, people fight on the streets and in virtual networks for the restoration of a public space. Digital practices are based on cooperation, inclusion, and participation. This leads to processes of political subjectivization which are not entirely based on pre-existing identities. Emancipation becomes the key topic of social debate. Also in the field of professional and practice-based education, it seems to be advisable to use ignorant schoolmasters as a springboard. They can start the emancipation process and can encourage reflexivity and creativity. The competent use of new media can contribute to individual education and to social transformation. Culture in the 21st century is increasingly a making and doing culture, at whose heart lies creativity and networking. This will and must define our future practices in the digital age. Thank you very much.